Hello there, wanderer. Welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Pour yourself something warm to drink, find that perfect spot where you're most comfortable, and let yourself settle in. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey together, a journey to a place that exists somewhere between dream and reality, between the pages of a beloved book and the snow-capped peaks of the highest mountains on Earth. Tonight, we're going to explore one of the most captivating mysteries of the 20th century. We're going to ask a question that has haunted explorers, mystics, and dreamers for nearly 100 years. Did Shangri-La really exist? The very name conjures something in us, doesn't it? Shangri-La. Even if you've never read the book or seen the film, you know what it means. Paradise, a hidden valley where time moves differently, a place of peace in a world too often consumed by chaos. But where did this name come from? Who created it? And why have so many people devoted their lives to finding it? Let the weight of the day fall away from your shoulders. There's nowhere you need to be right now, nothing you need to do. Just listen and let your mind wander with me through mountain passes and forgotten manuscripts, through the imagination of a British novelist and the dusty archives of explorers who ventured into places the modern world had barely touched. We'll walk through ancient Buddhist monasteries and stand before peaks so tall they scrape the very edge of the sky. We'll meet the people who believed in Shangri-La with such fervor that they risked everything to find it. This is a story about longing, about the universal human need to believe that somewhere, somehow, there exists a place where suffering ends and wisdom prevails. It's about the power of fiction to shape reality, and the ways that reality can inspire the most beautiful fictions. It's about what happens when the two become so intertwined that we can no longer tell where one ends and the other begins. So take a deep breath, let it out slowly, and let's begin our journey to the Valley of Shangri-La. The year is 1933. The world is still reeling from the devastation of the First World War, that terrible conflict that was supposed to end all wars, but instead left entire generations traumatized and disillusioned. The Great Depression has the global economy in its grip. In Germany, Adolf Hitler has just been appointed chancellor, and dark clouds are gathering over Europe once more. In this atmosphere of anxiety and upheaval, people are hungry for escape. They want to believe that somewhere, beyond the reach of politics and poverty and the threat of another war, there exists a place of perfect peace. Into this moment steps a British novelist named James Hilton. He's 33 years old, the same age as the century itself, and though he's published several novels already, he hasn't yet achieved the literary fame he craves. But he's about to change that. He's about to create something that will outlive him, that will enter the very language itself, that will send people to the far corners of the earth searching for a place he invented in his London home. Hilton sits in his study, not far from the British Museum Library, where he's been conducting research. He's been reading everything he can find about Tibet, that mysterious land locked away behind the highest mountains on Earth. He's pored over accounts from missionaries who ventured into Central Asia centuries before. He's studied the journals of explorers and botanists, and based on the geographical similarities later discovered between his novel and certain National Geographic articles, it appears he was particularly captivated by a series of pieces written by an Austrian-American botanist named Joseph Rock, describing his expeditions into the remote borderlands between China and Tibet. The images Rock captured are extraordinary. Snow-covered peaks rising into impossibly blue skies, ancient monasteries clinging to mountainsides, Tibetan monks in crimson robes, valleys so remote that they seem untouched by the modern world. And as Hilton reads these accounts, as he studies these photographs, something begins to take shape in his imagination. A story about a group of people who find themselves in one of these hidden valleys, in a place called Shangri-La. Let's pause here for a moment and really picture this. Imagine yourself in Hilton's position. You're sitting in London, in one of the world's great imperial capitals, surrounded by the noise and bustle of modern civilization. But you're reading about places so far removed from all of that, places where people live according to ancient rhythms, where monasteries preserve knowledge that's been passed down for centuries, where time itself seems to move at a different pace. How intoxicating that must have been. How easy to let your imagination soar into those remote valleys and ask yourself, what if? What if there was a place where all the world's troubles fell away? What if you could find a valley where people lived for hundreds of years, where wisdom was valued above all else, where conflict and suffering were unknown? And so Hilton begins to write. The words flow from him with unusual ease, as if the story has been waiting to be told, as if Shangri-La already exists somewhere, and he's merely the medium through which it can make itself known to the world. He writes about a British consul named Hugh Conway, who, along with 3 other passengers, is on a plane evacuating them from a revolution in India. But something goes wrong, or perhaps something goes exactly as planned. The plane is hijacked, its pilot taking them far off course, deep into the mountains of Tibet. They fly over peaks that seem to touch the heavens themselves, through air so thin and cold it burns the lungs. And then the plane crashes. The pilot dies, but not before telling Conway, in Chinese, to seek shelter at a nearby lamasery. And it's there, in that monastery, called Shangri-La, hidden in a valley Hilton calls the Valley of the Blue Moon, that the real story begins. It's there that Conway and his companions discover a community unlike any they've ever known, a place where people from all over the world have gathered to preserve the wisdom and culture of humanity, safe from the wars and troubles that plague the outside world. A place where the passing of years barely touches the inhabitants, where people live for decades, even centuries, aging so slowly as to seem almost immortal. At the heart of Shangri-La is the High Lama, the founder and spiritual leader of the community. He's impossibly old, over 200 years, and he's gathered to this remote valley the world's greatest treasures. Not gold or jewels, though there's wealth enough. No, what matters here are books, art, music, knowledge, everything that makes human civilization worthwhile. And the High Lama has brought these things to Shangri-La for a reason. He believes that another great war is coming, one that will engulf the world in destruction. And when that war is over, when the outside world has torn itself apart, Shangri-La will remain. The monks will emerge with all they've preserved, ready to help rebuild civilization from the ashes. It's a powerful vision, and Conway finds himself seduced by it. The life he led before, the ambitions and achievements that once seemed so important, all of that begins to feel hollow compared to the peace and purpose he finds in this hidden valley. But not everyone feels the same way. His companions react differently to Shangri-La. Some embrace it. Others desperately want to leave, to return to the world they know, even if that world is falling apart. Hilton published Lost Horizon in 1933, and it became an instant sensation. Here was exactly what people needed in that dark and troubled time. A vision of a place where peace was possible, where wisdom could be preserved, where humanity's best qualities could flourish, away from the madness consuming the world. The book sold hundreds of thousands of copies. It was translated into dozens of languages. In 1937, the legendary Hollywood director Frank Capra turned it into a major motion picture, with Ronald Colman playing Conway. The film was one of the most expensive ever made at that time, and it introduced Shangri-La to millions more people. And here's what's remarkable. Hilton never actually went to Tibet. He never stood in those mountain valleys or walked through those monasteries. He created Shangri-La entirely from his imagination, drawing on the accounts and photographs of others. And yet the place he created felt so real, so vivid, so possible, that people immediately began to wonder, could it actually exist? Could there really be a hidden valley somewhere in the Himalayas where Shangri-La waited to be discovered? The name itself stuck in a way that few fictional creations ever do. Within years of the book's publication, Shangri-La had entered the English language as a synonym for paradise, for any earthly utopia, for that perfect place we all dream about, but can never quite reach. When President Franklin Delano Roosevelt needed a retreat from the pressures of the presidency, he established a sanctuary in the mountains of Maryland and named it Shangri-La. Today we know it as Camp David, renamed by President Eisenhower for his grandson, but Roosevelt's choice of that original name tells you everything about how deeply Hilton's creation had penetrated the popular consciousness. During World War II, when the United States launched the Doolittle raid, the first American air attack on the Japanese home islands, a reporter asked President Roosevelt where the planes had come from. In order to protect the secrecy of the mission, Roosevelt replied that they had launched from Shangri-La. The joke worked because everyone knew what Shangri-La was, that impossible, unreachable place. And when the Navy commissioned a new aircraft carrier in 1944, they named it the USS Shangri-La, and it served with distinction through the end of the war. Think about that for a moment. A place that existed only in a novel, only in one man's imagination, became real enough to name presidential retreats and aircraft carriers after. Became real enough that when someone said the name, everyone understood immediately what was meant. That's the power of a truly resonant story. That's what happens when fiction touches something deep and true in the human heart. But here's where our story gets even more interesting. Because Hilton didn't create Shangri-La out of nothing. He drew on sources, and those sources drew on something even older. The legend of Shangri-La has roots that go back not decades, but centuries. Not to a British novelist's study, but to ancient Buddhist texts and Hindu scriptures. Hilton's fictional paradise was inspired by a much older legend, a legend about a hidden kingdom called Shambhala. And it's to Shambhala that we must turn our attention now, because if we want to understand whether Shangri-La could have been real, we need to understand the ancient tradition from which it emerged. We need to journey even further back in time to texts written by monks and mystics who described a paradise that sounds remarkably similar to the valley Hilton would later imagine. A place of wisdom and peace hidden away from the world, waiting to be found by those pure enough in heart and spirit to make the journey. So let's go there now. Let's travel back through the centuries to discover the legend of Shambhala, the kingdom that may have inspired not just Hilton's novel, but centuries of spiritual seekers and explorers who believed that somewhere in the vast ranges of Central Asia, paradise could still be found. Take another deep breath. Let your mind open to what we're about to explore. Because the story of Shambhala is older and stranger and more beautiful than you might imagine. In the ancient texts of Tibetan Buddhism, particularly in a collection of teachings called the Kalachakra Tantra, there are descriptions of a hidden kingdom. This kingdom has many names. The Hindus call it Aryavartha, meaning the land of the worthy ones. The Chinese know it as Sitian, the Western Paradise. But the most common name, the one that has come down through the centuries, is Shambhala. In Sanskrit, the name means place of peace or place of silence. It is said to be a land where only the pure of heart can enter, where those who have achieved enlightenment live in perfect harmony, free from suffering, want, and old age. Now, this isn't just some vague notion that appears briefly in one or two texts. Shambhala is described extensively and consistently across multiple ancient sources, both Buddhist and Hindu. The legend dates back thousands of years. The Buddhist myth of Shambhala is actually an adaptation of an earlier Hindu tradition. In Hindu texts like the Vishnu Purana, which dates to the 4th century, Shambhala is mentioned as the birthplace of Kalki, the 10th and final incarnation of the god Vishnu. According to the prophecy, when the world descends into chaos and darkness, when evil seems to have triumphed, Kalki will emerge from Shambhala to usher in a new golden age of peace and prosperity. But it's in the Buddhist tradition, particularly in Tibet, where the legend of Shambhala truly flourishes. The Kalachakra Tantra, which emerged in India around the 10th or 11th century, contains the most detailed descriptions. According to these texts, Shambhala is a kingdom located somewhere to the north, hidden behind 8 mountain ranges, each one more formidable than the last. These mountains form a protective barrier, making Shambhala inaccessible to all but those who are meant to find it. Picture this place as the ancient texts describe it. Shambhala is said to be shaped like an enormous 8-petaled lotus flower. At its center stands the capital city, Kalapa, and at the heart of that city is a magnificent palace where the kings of Shambhala reside. These are not ordinary kings. They are called Kulika kings or Kalki kings, and they are wise and enlightened beings who rule not through force, but through dharma, through righteous law and spiritual teaching. Under their benevolent guidance, the people of Shambhala live in a state of unprecedented harmony and prosperity. The texts tell us that the inhabitants of Shambhala have access to advanced knowledge, both spiritual and material. They understand the deepest secrets of the mind and the universe. They live exceptionally long lives because they have achieved such a high degree of spiritual development that the ordinary processes of aging and disease barely touch them. They don't experience the suffering and conflict that plague the outside world. Instead, they devote themselves to study, meditation, and the perfection of their spiritual practice. But here's what makes Shambhala especially interesting. According to the Buddhist tradition, it's not just a spiritual allegory or a state of mind, though it can certainly be understood that way. No, the texts insist that Shambhala is also a real, physical place that exists somewhere in our world. It's hidden, yes. It's protected by powerful forces, both natural and supernatural, yes. But it's there, somewhere, waiting to be found by those worthy of finding it. The Kalachakra teachings actually present Shambhala on 3 different levels. And understanding this is crucial to grasping what Shambhala really means. The first level is called the external level, and this is Shambhala as a physical kingdom, a real place, somewhere in the mountains of Central Asia where these enlightened beings actually live. The second level is the internal level, and this relates to the subtle body and the chakras, particularly the heart chakra. In this understanding, Shambhala represents a state of being, a level of consciousness that one can achieve through proper practice. The third level is called the alternative level, and this deals with the deepest practices of Tantric Buddhism, the ways of transforming consciousness itself. Now, here's where it gets really fascinating. The legend says that the Buddha himself taught the Kalachakra to the first king of Shambhala, a man named Suchandra, who traveled from Shambhala to India specifically to receive these teachings. Suchandra then returned to his kingdom and established the Kalachakra tradition there. For generations, the kings of Shambhala have maintained and protected these teachings, and they continue to do so to this day, hidden away from a world that isn't ready to receive such profound wisdom. There's also a prophecy associated with Shambhala, and it's this prophecy that has captivated so many people over the centuries. The texts tell us that in the future, when the world has descended into its darkest hour, when ignorance and hatred have reached their peak, the 25th Kulika king, whose name will be Rudra Chakrin, will lead an army out of Shambhala. This won't be a war of conquest or destruction. Rather, it will be a spiritual battle, a triumph of wisdom over ignorance, of compassion over hatred. Rudra Chakran will defeat the forces of darkness and establish a golden age of peace throughout the world. Think about how powerful this idea is. In times of trouble, in times when everything seems to be falling apart, people can look toward Shambhala and believe that help is coming, that somewhere the wise beings of this hidden kingdom are preparing, waiting for the right moment to emerge and set the world right. It's a vision of hope in the face of despair, a promise that darkness will not have the final word. The texts also describe how to reach Shambhala, though the instructions are deliberately cryptic. They speak of traveling north from India, crossing mountains and deserts, passing through various kingdoms and over dangerous terrain. Some versions mention that the journey takes months or even years. Others suggest that finding Shambhala requires more than just physical travel, that the seeker must also undergo spiritual preparation, purifying their mind and heart to become worthy of entry. Various locations have been proposed for Shambhala over the centuries, though none have been definitively confirmed. Some ancient Zhangzhang texts from a culture that predated Tibetan Buddhism in western Tibet have been interpreted as identifying Shambhala with the Sutlej Valley in what is now Punjab or Himachal Pradesh in India. Mongolian traditions associate it with certain valleys of southern Siberia. In Altai folklore, Mount Baluka is believed to be the gateway to Shambhala. Some modern Buddhist scholars have suggested it might be located in the higher reaches of the Himalayas, in what are now called the Daladar Mountains, around McLeod Ganj. The 14th Dalai Lama has addressed this question, and during a Kala Chakra initiation in 1985, he suggested that the location might be better understood as being in a different dimension of reality, rather than at a specific geographic location in our ordinary world. And this brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of the Shambhala legend. Many teachers and scholars emphasize that Shambhala exists on the very edge of physical reality. It's described as a bridge, a place that connects our ordinary world to something beyond it. According to some interpretations of the tradition, the entrance to Shambhala is hidden inside a remote, abandoned monastery somewhere in Tibet, guarded by beings known as the Shambhala Guardians, who prevent the unworthy from entering. Other teachings suggest that Shambhala exists in a parallel dimension, occupying the same geographic space as part of our world, but vibrating at a different frequency, invisible and intangible to those who haven't achieved the necessary spiritual development. This multifaceted nature of Shambhala is actually one of its great strengths as a legend. It can be all things to all people. For those who need to believe in a literal paradise, a real place they might someday find, Shambhala offers that possibility. For those whose approach is more philosophical or spiritual, Shambhala represents an inner journey, a state of enlightenment to be achieved through practice and dedication. And for those who see it as purely allegorical, Shambhala serves as a beautiful metaphor for humanity's highest aspirations, our dreams of a better world. But let's be clear about something important. To the Tibetan people, to the monks who preserve and teach the Kala Chakra, Shambhala is not a fairy tale. It's part of their authentic spiritual tradition, woven into the very fabric of their religious practice. The Kala Chakra initiation, which involves detailed visualizations of Shambhala and its mandala, is one of the most important and elaborate ceremonies in Tibetan Buddhism. The Dalai Lama himself has given the Kala Chakra initiation many times, and when he does, 18th and 20th centuries, Shambhala became something different. It became tangled up with theosophy, with occultism, with romanticized notions of the mysterious East. The legend was appropriated and reshaped to fit Western spiritual movements that had their own agendas and interpretations. This doesn't make those movements wrong or bad necessarily, but it does mean that the picture of Shambhala that entered Western consciousness was often quite different from the traditional Buddhist understanding. Helena Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophical Society in the late 19th century, claimed to be in telepathic contact with masters from Shambhala. She wrote extensively about the kingdom in her works, but her descriptions mixed Buddhist legend with her own esoteric teachings and with elements borrowed from other traditions. This theosophical version of Shambhala emphasized the idea of hidden masters, ascended beings who guide humanity's evolution from behind the scenes. It presented Shambhala as a headquarters of sorts for these masters, a place where they conducted their work advancing human consciousness. The Russian artist and mystic Nicholas Roerich became utterly fascinated with Shambhala. In the 1920s, he led expeditions through Central Asia, ostensibly for scientific and artistic purposes, but really searching for the hidden kingdom. He painted numerous works depicting his vision of Shambhala, usually showing it as a city bathed in blue light, with golden temples nestled among snow-covered peaks. Roerich wrote books about his search, and he claimed at various points to have found signs and portents indicating he was on the right track, though he never actually located Shambhala itself. Even the Soviet Union got in on the act, in a rather dark and strange way. In the 1920s, Gleb Boki, a chief Bolshevik cryptographer and one of the bosses of the Soviet secret police, along with his writer friend Alexander Barchenko, embarked on a quest for Shambhala. They had this wild idea of merging Buddhist Tantra with communist ideology, using the spiritual techniques supposedly practiced in Shambhala to engineer perfect communist citizens. In a secret laboratory, they experimented with meditation and other Buddhist practices, trying to find the key to human perfection. They even planned a major expedition to Inner Asia to retrieve the wisdom of Shambhala, though the project ultimately fell apart due to Soviet internal politics and rivalries between different agencies. The Nazi regime, too, showed interest in Tibet during the 1930s. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, was fascinated by esoteric theories, and the regime sent expeditions to Tibet. Some accounts written after the war have claimed these expeditions were searching for Shambhala and connections to Aryan origins, though modern historians approach many of these claims with considerable skepticism, noting that the evidence is often exaggerated or comes from questionable sources. What's certain is that various groups projected their own ideologies onto Tibet and its legends, often distorting the original spiritual teachings in the process. What all these Western appropriations of the Shambhala legend have in common is that they project onto it their own desires and ideologies. Theosophists see it as validation of their teachings about hidden masters. Communists imagine it as a source of techniques for social engineering. Nazis search for evidence of Aryan supremacy. Each group takes this beautiful Buddhist legend and reshapes it to serve their own purposes. But beneath all these distortions and appropriations, the original legend remains. Shambhala, as described in the ancient texts, a hidden kingdom of peace and wisdom, a place where enlightened beings preserve the Dharma and prepare for the day when they will emerge to help transform the world. Whether this kingdom exists as a physical place, as a spiritual state, or as a powerful metaphor, depends perhaps on what the seeker brings to their search. The texts themselves suggest that all three levels are true simultaneously, that Shambhala is real in multiple ways at once. And it was this ancient legend that James Hilton encountered in his research, filtered through the accounts of Western travelers and missionaries who had ventured into Tibet. It was this legend that provided the foundation upon which he would build his fictional Shangri-La. But there was another crucial influence on Hilton's creation, another source that gave shape and substance to his imagined valley. And that source was the work of a remarkable man, an explorer and botanist who spent decades in the remote borderlands between China and Tibet, documenting everything he saw and sending his photographs and articles back to the West. His name was Joseph Rock, and without his work, Shangri-La might never have existed at all. So let's turn our attention now to this fascinating character, this eccentric adventurer whose expeditions into forbidden territory provided the raw material from which a legend would be born. Joseph Francis Charles Rock was born in Vienna, Austria in 1884. From the very beginning, his life seemed destined for adventure, though perhaps not in the way one might expect. His childhood was difficult. His mother died when he was young, and his relationship with his father was troubled. He suffered from tuberculosis, and doctors told him he wouldn't live to see adulthood. But Rock had a fierce will to survive, and an insatiable curiosity about the natural world. He taught himself languages, studied plants with obsessive dedication, and dreamed of traveling to places far beyond the confines of Imperial Vienna. In 1905, at the age of 21, Rock emigrated to the United States. 2 years later, he arrived in Hawaii, and it was there that his life truly began. He became fascinated by the island's unique flora, teaching himself botany through direct observation and tireless study. Despite having no formal university training in the subject, Rock became one of the foremost experts on Hawaiian plants. He joined the faculty of the College of Hawaii, founded the first herbarium there, and published extensively on the native plant life. But Hawaii, beautiful as it was, couldn't contain his restless spirit. Rock wanted to explore territory that was truly unknown, to venture into regions where Western science had never penetrated. In 1920, Rock got his chance. Various American institutions, including the United States Department of Agriculture, Harvard University, and the National Geographic Society, began sponsoring his expeditions to Asia. They wanted plant specimens, seeds, biological samples. They wanted someone who could document the flora and fauna of regions that were still largely unmapped and unexplored. Rock was perfect for the job. He had the botanical knowledge, the physical stamina, despite his earlier illness, and most importantly, he had the courage bordering on recklessness necessary to travel into some of the most dangerous territory on Earth. From 1922 until 1949, with only brief interruptions, Rock made his base in southwestern China, particularly in the province of Yunnan and in the Tibetan borderlands of Sichuan and Gansu. He established his headquarters in a stone house near the town of Lijiang, at the foot of Jade Dragon Snow Mountain, that stunning blue pyramid of ice and rock that marks the eastern limit of the Himalayas. From this base, Rock launched expedition after expedition into the wild mountains beyond. Let's try to picture what these expeditions were like, because this is important for understanding how Rock's work influenced Hilton's creation of Shangri-La. Rock didn't travel light or rough it like some explorers. No, he brought with him a peculiar combination of scientific rigor and eccentric luxury. His caravan would consist of dozens of porters carrying his equipment, his specimens, his supplies. He brought along a collapsible bathtub so he could have proper baths in the wilderness. He dined off gold-plated dinner service, sitting alone in his tent eating Western-style meals, while his guides and porters ate separately. He wore a solar helmet to protect himself from the sun, and carried a Colt .45 revolver and would fire it into the air at sunset to frighten off bandits. He was particular, demanding, often difficult to work with, but he was also absolutely dedicated to his work. And oh, the places he went. Rock traveled through regions where no Westerner, and in some cases no outsider of any kind, had ventured before. He visited the kingdom of Muli, a strange theocracy ruled by a living Buddha known as the King of Muli. This was a place where time seemed to have stopped centuries before, where monks in crimson robes carried ancient muskets, and the social structure hadn't changed in generations. Rock photographed everything. He documented the giant bronze Buddha at Muli, 50 feet tall, which would later disappear during the chaos of the Communist Revolution. He recorded the customs, the clothing, the architecture, the daily life of people living in ways that would soon be swept away by the tides of modernization. Rock traveled to the sacred mountain called Minyakonka, known to locals as Gongashan, which rises to well over 24,000 feet. He photographed 3 particular peaks that the local Tibetans considered especially holy, calling them by the names of Buddhist deities. These were Shenrezig, Manjushri, and Chana Dorje, forming what's now known as the Ya Ding Nature Reserve. The images Rock captured of these mountains are breathtaking. Pyramids of ice and rock thrusting into skies of impossible blue, prayer flags streaming in the wind, monasteries perched on ridges that seemed too narrow and too high for human habitation. He explored the massive ranges of the Umne Makin and the Kunlun Mountains, territories so remote and dangerous that even the Chinese authorities feared to venture there. He traveled through lands controlled by fiercely independent Tibetan and Agolak tribes who didn't recognize any government's authority. On multiple occasions, Rock found himself caught up in conflicts between different warlords, between Chinese Muslim forces and Tibetan warriors, between various groups all struggling for control of these wild borderlands. He witnessed battles, documented atrocities, and somehow managed to keep collecting his plant specimens and taking his photographs through it all. But it was the articles Rock wrote for National Geographic that really changed everything. Between 1922 and 1935, the magazine published 9 illustrated features based on Rock's expeditions. And these weren't just dry scientific reports. Rock had a gift for vivid, dramatic writing. He described the landscapes in ways that made readers feel they were there with him. He wrote about the terror of crossing rope bridges over raging rivers, about nights spent in monasteries where the chanting of monks echoed through cold stone halls, about mountains so high and so beautiful they seemed like something from another world. The photographs that accompanied these articles were stunning. Remember, this was the 1920s and 30s, when most Americans had never seen anything like these images. Rock worked with glass plate negatives, which were heavy and fragile and difficult to transport, but which produced photographs of remarkable clarity and detail. He also used a color photography process called autochrome, which was cutting-edge technology at the time. His color images of Tibet, with their rich blues and deep reds and golden yellows, must have seemed almost magical to readers used to black and white. One article in particular seems to have caught James Hilton's attention. In April of 1925, National Geographic published Rock's piece titled "The Land of the Yellow Llama." National Geographic Society Explorer visits the strange kingdom of Muli. The article described Rock's journey to Muli, his encounters with the king of Muli, the strange, isolated nature of this mountain kingdom, and the stunning landscape surrounding it. Rock wrote about valleys hidden behind mountain ranges, about monasteries preserving ancient wisdom, about a way of life utterly different from anything in the modern Western world. Researchers, particularly an American lawyer and mountaineer named Ted Vail, have painstakingly compared the descriptions in Lost Horizon with Rock's National Geographic articles and found at least 22 specific points of similarity. The geography matches, the descriptions of buildings and monasteries match, the details about local clothing and customs match, even some of the names seem to echo what Rock wrote about. It's clear that Hilton used Rock's articles as source material, drawing from them to create the detailed, believable setting for his fictional Shangri-La. There's even a fascinating piece of anecdotal evidence, though it remains unverified. Jane Wyatt, who starred in the 1937 film adaptation of Lost Horizon, later recounted in an interview that James Hilton, who worked as a consultant during the making of the film, had told her directly that Joseph Rock's National Geographic articles had indeed influenced him. According to the story, this conversation happened after the tape recorder had stopped running during Wyatt's interview, so there's no recording to confirm it. The account has been repeated by several researchers, but without documented proof, it remains in the category of compelling but unverifiable oral history.
Rock himself never sought credit for inspiring Shangri-La. In fact, there's no evidence he ever said anything publicly about the connection. He continued his work in China until 1949, when the Communist Revolution forced him to leave. He eventually settled back in Hawaii, where he devoted his remaining years to completing a massive encyclopedic dictionary of the Nakshi language, documenting the unique pictographic writing system of the Nakshi people, among whom he had lived for so long. He died in 1962 of a heart attack, having preserved in his photographs and writings a world that was already disappearing, a world that existed in that brief window between the old ways and modernity's total transformation of the landscape. But through Rock's work, through the articles and photographs he sent back from those remote mountains, the Western world got a glimpse of something extraordinary. They saw that there really were hidden valleys in the Himalayas, really were ancient monasteries preserving wisdom, really were places where the modern world hadn't yet penetrated. Rock proved that the reality could be almost as astonishing as any fiction. And in doing so, he provided the foundation upon which James Hilton could build Shangri-La. He made the impossible seem possible. He made people believe that yes, maybe, just maybe, somewhere in those vast, unmapped ranges, a place like Shangri-La really could exist. Of course, Rock wasn't the only Westerner exploring Tibet in those years. To understand how Shangri-La captured the imagination so completely, we need to look at the broader context of how the West viewed Tibet in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Because Tibet occupied a unique place in the Western imagination, a place quite different from how the West viewed other Asian countries and cultures. Think about it from the perspective of a European or American in the late 1800s. Much of Asia had been colonized or forcibly opened to Western trade and influence. India was under British rule. China had been humiliated in the Opium Wars and forced to open its ports. Japan was rapidly modernizing and westernizing. Southeast Asia was divided up among various European colonial powers. The Great Colonial Project was reaching its apex, with Western powers carving up the world among themselves, confident in their technological and cultural superiority. But Tibet was different. Tibet remained closed, mysterious, largely inaccessible to foreigners. It sat there on the roof of the world, protected by the highest mountains on earth, maintaining its ancient Buddhist culture while the rest of Asia was being transformed. The Tibetan government, under the Dalai Lama and his regents, had a policy of extreme caution regarding foreigners. They'd seen what happened to their neighbours when Western powers gained a foothold, and they wanted no part of it. So they kept their borders closed, turned back would-be visitors and maintained their isolation. This inaccessibility, of course, only made Tibet more fascinating to Westerners. It became the last great mystery, the ultimate forbidden territory. Where Western powers couldn't penetrate through force or diplomacy, individual adventurers would try through cunning and determination. Throughout the 19th century, various explorers attempted to reach Lhasa, the Tibetan capital, often in disguise, and most were turned back or worse. The few who succeeded brought back tales that only heightened the mystery and allure. The religious nature of Tibetan society also contributed to its mystique. This was a land where Buddhism wasn't just a religion, but the organizing principle of the entire society. A significant portion of the male population became monks. Monasteries were centers of learning and power. The belief in reincarnation and in tulkus, beings who could remember their past lives and continue their spiritual work across multiple lifetimes, seemed exotic and mystical to Western audiences. The very idea of the Dalai Lama, a spiritual leader who was also a political ruler, who was believed to be the reincarnation of the Bodhisattva of compassion, fascinated people raised in Christian traditions where such concepts didn't exist. Into this context came explorers and writers who projected onto Tibet their own spiritual longings and romantic notions. One of the most influential was Alexandre David Niel, a Belgian-French explorer and Buddhist practitioner who spent years traveling through Tibet and studying with various lamas and teachers. In 1924, she became one of the first Western women to reach Lhasa, and she wrote extensively about her experiences. Her book, My Journey to Lhasa, published in 1927, became a sensation and helped establish her as the Western authority on Tibetan Buddhism and culture. David Niel's writings emphasized the mystical and spiritual dimensions of Tibet. She described meditation practices, which, according to practitioners, could generate physical heat, allowing them to survive in freezing temperatures wearing only thin robes. She wrote about Lungompa, runners who were said to enter a trance state and travel incredible distances at remarkable speeds. She described encounters with hermit yogis living in remote caves who claimed to have achieved levels of spiritual realization that seemed impossible by ordinary standards. Her accounts, whether taken as literal reportage or as more impressionistic reflections on Tibetan spiritual culture, certainly captured readers' imaginations and contributed to the image of Tibet as a land of extraordinary spiritual practices. Another important figure was Francis Younghusband, a British military officer and explorer who led an armed expedition to Lhasa in 1903 to 1904. Ironically, although this expedition represented exactly the kind of Western intrusion Tibet had been trying to avoid, Younghusband himself was profoundly affected by his time in Tibet. He had what he described as a mystical experience near Lhasa, a moment of spiritual awakening that changed his life. After returning to Britain, he spent his remaining years writing about spirituality and promoting interfaith understanding. He described Tibet as possessing a sacred dimension, a quality of spiritual depth that he felt was lacking in the modern West. The Theosophical Society, which we mentioned earlier, played an enormous role in shaping Western perceptions of Tibet. Founded in 1875 by Helena Blavatsky and others, Theosophy sought to synthesize elements from various religious and philosophical traditions, particularly drawing on Eastern sources.
Blavatsky claimed to be in contact with Mahatmas, or masters, enlightened beings who supposedly lived in Tibet and other remote locations, and who were guiding humanity's spiritual evolution. She never actually went to Tibet herself, but she wrote extensively about it, based on, she claimed, astral travel and psychic communication. The Theosophical movement introduced ideas about Shambhala and Tibetan spirituality to a wide Western audience. They published books and magazines, established lodges in cities around the world, and attracted followers who were disillusioned with conventional Western religion and attracted to the mystical traditions of the East. By the early 20th century, largely due to Theosophical influence, Tibet had become associated in the Western mind with hidden wisdom, psychic powers, ascended masters, and the possibility of radical spiritual transformation. Nicholas Roerich, the Russian artist and mystic we mentioned earlier, was heavily influenced by Theosophy. His expeditions through Central Asia in the 1920s were ostensibly for artistic and scientific purposes. He was collecting plant specimens, studying local cultures, creating paintings of the landscapes. But his real quest was spiritual. He believed he was searching for Shambhala, or at least for signs and portents that would lead him closer to the hidden kingdom. Roerich traveled with his wife Helena and their son through some of the most forbidding terrain in Asia. They crossed over 30 mountain passes, endured extreme cold and altitude, and at one point mysteriously disappeared for a time before emerging again. In his writings, particularly in his book simply titled Shambhala, published in 1930, Roerich described conversations with lamas and local people about the hidden kingdom. He quoted one lama as telling him, "Great Shambhala is far beyond the ocean. It is the mighty heavenly domain. It has nothing to do with our earth." But this didn't dissuade Roerich. At one point during his travels, he claimed to have found what might be an entrance to Shambhala, a doorway blocked up with stones in a remote mountain location.
He never gave the exact coordinates, never led anyone else to this spot, which has led some to question whether the story was literal truth or spiritual metaphor. But here's the thing about all these Western explorers and mystics and their quests for hidden kingdoms and spiritual wisdom in Tibet. However sincere they may have been, however genuine their spiritual seeking, they were also engaged in a kind of projection. They were taking their own desires, their own dissatisfaction with Western materialism and modernity, and projecting it onto Tibet. They were creating what scholars call an Orientalist image of the East, one that said more about Western anxieties and longings than it did about the actual reality of Tibetan culture.
Real Tibet, the Tibet where actual Tibetan people lived their lives, was of course more complicated than these romantic visions suggested. It had its own politics, its own social stratification, its own problems and conflicts. The monastic system, while preserving and transmitting profound spiritual teachings, also had issues with corruption and abuse of power. The isolation that Westerners found so enchanting also meant poverty in many areas, limited access to medical care and education, and vulnerability when political pressures from outside finally did penetrate. But in the 1920s and 30s, most Westerners didn't see this complexity. What they saw, what they wanted to see, was a land of wisdom and peace, a place that offered an alternative to the destructive trajectory of Western civilization. And this was the critical context in which James Hilton wrote Lost Horizon. He was tapping into a deep vein of Western fascination with Tibet, a fascination fed by genuine explorers like Joseph Rock and Alexandra David-Nell, by mystics like Roerich and the Theosophists, and by the simple fact that Tibet remained one of the few places on Earth that seemed beyond the reach of modernity's transforming touch.
Hilton took all of this, the real explorations and the mystical speculations, the actual photographs and the spiritual longings, and he wove it together into his fictional Shangri-La. He gave people exactly what they wanted, a vision of a hidden valley where all their dreams of peace and wisdom and escape from the troubles of the world could be realized. And because he based his vision on real places described by real explorers, because the geography and the monasteries and the mountain peaks were drawn from actual accounts, Shangri-La felt real in a way that purely imaginary places often don't. This brings us to one of the most interesting questions about Shangri-La. Given that it's based on real places, given that explorers really did find hidden valleys and ancient monasteries in the Himalayas, given that the legend of Shambhala predates Hilton's novel by centuries, is it possible that someone actually did search for Shangri-La? Not the fictional place from the book, but the real locations that might have inspired it? Did anyone try to find the actual valley that Hilton described, or at least to locate the places that Rock photographed? The answer is yes. From the moment Lost Horizon was published, people became interested in finding the real Shangri-La. And this search took on new urgency after World War II, when the world had indeed experienced the catastrophe that Hilton's High Lama had predicted, and people were even more desperate to believe in a place of sanctuary and peace. Various expeditions have been launched over the decades, some with scholarly purposes, others driven by tourism and commercial interests, and still others motivated by genuine spiritual seeking. Some searchers focused on the Hunza Valley in what is now Pakistan. This valley, located in the Karakoram mountain range, has its own reputation as a kind of Shangri-La. The people of Hunza are known for their longevity and health. The valley is stunningly beautiful, with terraced fields and orchards set against a backdrop of snow-covered peaks. Some claim that Hilton visited this area before writing his novel and based Shangri-La on what he saw there, though evidence for this is thin. Hilton was notoriously vague about his inspirations and never confirmed visiting Hunza. Other searchers have looked in Nepal and Bhutan,
particularly in the more remote northern regions, where valleys can still be found that are relatively untouched by modern development. These areas, with their Buddhist monasteries and traditional way of life, can indeed feel like stepping back in time. But while they're beautiful and culturally rich, they're not unknown or hidden in the way Shangri-La is supposed to be. They're real places where real people live, not lost kingdoms waiting to be discovered. And then there's the situation in China, particularly in Yunnan province, which brings us to one of the most fascinating chapters in the story of Shangri-La. Because in the late 1990s, Chinese officials and scholars began looking at Hilton's novel and at Joseph Rock's articles, and they started asking themselves a question. Could they identify the real places that inspired Shangri-La? And more importantly, could they use this connection to promote tourism and economic development in poor mountain regions? In 1997, a man named Shon Kei, a local scholar and musician in Yunnan, published an article arguing that the places Rock had visited and photographed in the Muli region and around the mountains of Yading were the real inspiration for Shangri-La. This idea was taken up by local government officials in Diqing Prefecture, where there was a county called Jiangden. The capital town of this county, also called Jiangden in Chinese or Gaothang in Tibetan, seemed to match many of the descriptions in Rock's articles. It was located in a beautiful valley surrounded by high mountains. There were ancient Tibetan monasteries nearby. The culture was deeply Buddhist. The scenery was spectacular. After considerable debate and some competition with other regions also claiming connections to Shangri-La, the Chinese government made an official decision. On December 17, 2001, Jiangden County was renamed Shangri-La County. In 2014, when the county was upgraded to county-level city status, it became Shangri-La City. This was an explicit, deliberate attempt to capitalize on the fame of Hilton's fictional paradise to attract tourists to a remote and economically struggling region. And you know what? It worked. Tourist numbers increased dramatically. Hotels were built, infrastructure improved, the airport in Diqing was renamed Shangri-La Airport. Train service was eventually extended to the area. Visitors started coming from all over China and from around the world, wanting to see the real Shangri-La. The old town area of what had been Jiangden, with its traditional Tibetan wooden houses, became a major tourist attraction. Now, there's something both wonderful and problematic about this development. On the positive side, the tourism has brought economic development to a region that desperately needed it. It's provided jobs and income for local Tibetan people. It's also motivated preservation efforts. The Songtsen Monastery, the largest Tibetan Buddhist monastery in Yunnan, has been restored and maintained. Natural areas like Pudatsuo National Park have been protected. The influx of visitors has brought attention and resources to environmental and cultural conservation. But there's also a darker side. The renaming of Jiangden to Shangri-La was pure marketing, a way to exploit a fictional creation for economic gain. The actual Tibetan name, Gaothang, was pushed aside in favor of a made-up English word from a British novel. There's an irony here that's hard to ignore. Shangri-La in Hilton's novel is a place hidden from the world, protected from the corrupting influences of modern civilization. But the real places now calling themselves Shangri-La are anything but hidden. They're destinations, commodified, packaged for consumption by tourists looking for an exotic experience. There's been some pushback from Tibetan cultural preservation advocates who argue that the commercialization threatens the authentic culture it's supposed to celebrate. When tourism becomes the main industry, there's pressure to present a sanitized theme park version of Tibetan culture rather than the complex reality. Traditional practices can become performances for visitors. Sacred sites become photo opportunities. The line between cultural sharing and cultural commodification becomes increasingly blurred. In 2014, a devastating fire swept through the Old Town area of Shangri-La City, destroying about half of the traditional wooden buildings. The fire was a tragic loss, but it also raised questions about how the rebuilt areas would balance preservation of authentic character with the demands of tourism infrastructure. When you rebuild for tourists, do you recreate what was genuinely there, or do you create an idealized version that matches visitors' expectations? It's a dilemma with no easy answer. But let's step back from these complicated modern realities and think about the broader cultural impact of Shangri-La. Because regardless of what's happening in Yunnan, or the debates about authenticity and commercialization, the fact remains that Hilton's creation entered the global consciousness in a way that very few fictional places ever have. Shangri-La became real in the sense that it became meaningful, a reference point that people across cultures could immediately understand and relate to. We already mentioned how President Franklin Roosevelt named his presidential retreat Shangri-La. This happened in 1942, less than a decade after the novel was published. Roosevelt was leading the country through World War II, dealing with pressures and responsibilities that would break most people. And he needed a place to escape, to rest, to think clearly away from the chaos of Washington. He chose to name the sanctuary after Hilton's fictional paradise because the name immediately conveyed what he was trying to create, a place of peace and renewal in the midst of global conflict. The name stuck until 1953, when President Eisenhower renamed it Camp David after his grandson. But for 11 years, the presidential retreat was known as Shangri-La. And during some of the most critical moments of the war, Roosevelt would retreat there to make decisions that would shape the course of history. Churchill visited Shangri-La. Other world leaders and important officials spent time there. The weight of those years, the decisions made in a place named after a fictional utopia, it adds another layer to the mythology.
And then there was the aircraft carrier. The USS Shangri-La, hull number CV-38, was an Essex-class carrier commissioned in September 1944. The name was chosen specifically as a reference to Roosevelt's joke about the Doolittle raid when he said the bombers had launched from Shangri-La. The ship served in the final year of World War II in the Pacific Theater, participating in the battles against Japan. After the war, it remained in service through the Cold War, was modernized several times, and finally decommissioned in 1971. Thousands of sailors served aboard USS Shangri-La over those decades, and to them, Shangri-La wasn't a mystical valley or a presidential retreat, but rather the steel deck beneath their feet, their home away from home on the ocean. The name Shangri-La became attached to hotels and resorts around the world. The first Shangri-La hotel opened in Singapore in 1971, founded by Robert Cook, a Malaysian Chinese businessman. Cook chose the name deliberately, wanting to evoke the kind of luxury, peace, and exceptional service that Hilton's fictional paradise represented. The brand grew into a global chain, with Shangri-La hotels now in cities across Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and North America. These hotels market themselves as havens of tranquility and refinement, promising guests an escape from the stresses of ordinary life. Its hospitality branding built on a literary reference from a 1933 novel. In popular culture, references to Shangri-La pop up constantly. Musicians have used the name in song titles and lyrics. The Kinks had a song called Shangri-La in 1969, though it was more about suburban disillusionment than mystical paradise. Numerous other bands and artists have drawn on the imagery. Films and television shows reference Shangri-La when they want to invoke the idea of a perfect but unattainable place. The Marvel Comics character Iron Fist draws on similar imagery with his mystical city of Kunlun, and DC Comics has Nanda Parbat, both clearly influenced by Hilton's creation. In everyday language, when someone says they're looking for their Shangri-La or describes a place as being like Shangri-La, everyone immediately understands what's meant. It's become linguistic shorthand for an earthly paradise, for that perfect place we all dream about finding. The word has transcended its origin to become part of our shared vocabulary for discussing human longings and dreams. This cultural penetration is remarkable when you think about it. Most fictional places, even from very popular books, don't achieve this status. Middle-earth is widely known thanks to Tolkien's enduring popularity, but you wouldn't use it as a general metaphor the way you would Shangri-La. Narnia, Wonderland, Oz, these are famous fictional locations, but they're fantasy realms, clearly separate from our reality.
Shangri-La is different because Hilton presented it as something that could actually exist in our world, hidden but real. And that ambiguity between fiction and possibility is what gave it such power. There's also something important about the timing. Shangri-La entered global consciousness in the 1930s and was reinforced during and after World War II. This was a period of unprecedented trauma and disruption. The Great Depression destroyed economic security for millions. Fascism rose in Europe and Asia. The war killed tens of millions and introduced weapons of such destructive power that humanity now possessed the means to annihilate itself. The old certainties, the Victorian confidence in progress and civilization, all of that was shattered. People desperately needed to believe in something better, in the possibility of peace and wisdom prevailing over violence and chaos. Shangri-La offered that hope. It suggested that somewhere, beyond the reach of bombs and armies and economic collapse, there existed a place where humanity's better nature could flourish. It promised that the wisdom and culture we valued wasn't necessarily going to be destroyed in the conflagration. The High Lama's vision of Shangri-La preserving civilization's treasures for the day when they could be shared again with a war-weary world, that vision resonated because people needed to believe it could be true. And that need didn't disappear after the war ended. The Cold War brought new anxieties, the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation. The 60s and 70s saw social upheaval, political assassinations, controversial wars, environmental crisis. Each generation seemed to face its own apocalyptic fears, its own reasons to dream of sanctuary and escape. Shangri-La remained relevant because the human condition it spoke to didn't change. We still wanted to believe in the possibility of peace. We still yearned for places where wisdom was valued over power, where people could live in harmony with each other and with nature. There's a philosophical dimension to Shangri-La that we should explore more deeply, because it's not just about escape or fantasy. When you actually look at what Hilton described in his novel, at the principles and practices of Shangri-La society, there's a coherent vision of what an ideal community might look like. It's worth taking seriously, even if we recognize it as fiction. The central principle of Shangri-La is moderation. This is emphasized repeatedly in the novel. The inhabitants don't pursue extreme experiences or intense emotions. They don't grasp after more and more wealth or power or pleasure. Instead, they cultivate a calm, balanced approach to life. They have what they need, they appreciate what they have, and they don't exhaust themselves striving for what they don't have. This moderation extends to their intellectual and spiritual pursuits as well. They study and learn and practice, but without the fevered intensity that often characterizes religious or philosophical seeking in the outside world. This emphasis on moderation is deeply Buddhist in character, which makes sense given that Shangri-La is presented as a Tibetan Buddhist lamasery. One of the core teachings of Buddhism is the middle way, avoiding the extremes of self-indulgence and self-mortification, finding the balanced path between opposites. The inhabitants of Shangri-La embody this teaching.
They're not ascetics denying themselves all pleasure, but neither are they hedonists pursuing sensory gratification. They live comfortably but simply, enjoying the beauty of their surroundings and the company of their fellow residents without needing constant stimulation or novelty. And it's this moderation, Hilton suggests, that contributes to their extraordinary longevity. People in Shangri-La age very slowly because they're not burning themselves out with stress and striving and intense emotions. They don't experience the kind of rapid deterioration that comes from constant stress and anxiety. Of course, Hilton also hints at something more mystical going on, some quality of the valley itself that affects its inhabitants. But the psychological component is clear. Peace of mind contributes to physical health and longevity. Another key aspect of Shangri-La is its eclecticism. The lamasery houses people from all over the world, of different nationalities, religions, and backgrounds. The High Lama himself is revealed to be Father Perot, a French Capuchin friar who arrived in the valley centuries before and established the community. His deputy, Chang, is Chinese. There are European scholars, Asian mystics, artists, and musicians from various cultures. What unites them isn't a single doctrine or belief system, but rather a shared appreciation for wisdom, beauty, and peaceful coexistence. This pluralistic vision was quite progressive for 1933. Hilton was writing at a time when nationalism was on the rise, when different ideologies were increasingly viewing each other as existential threats, when the world seemed to be fracturing along lines of race, religion, and political philosophy. To present a community where such differences were not only tolerated but celebrated, where a Christian friar could lead a Buddhist lamasery without contradiction, this was a radical reimagining of how human beings might organize themselves. The relationship between Shangri-La and the outside world is also fascinating. The valley isn't completely isolated. Occasionally, new people arrive, usually through circumstances beyond their control, like Conway and his companions after their plane crash. The inhabitants of Shangri-La then have to decide whether these newcomers are suitable to stay. Not everyone is. Some people can't adapt to the peaceful rhythm of life there. Some are too attached to their ambitions and desires from the outside world.
Only those who can let go of their old identities and embrace the Shangri-La way of life are invited to remain permanently. But even those who do stay maintain some connection to the outside world. They read books and newspapers from beyond the mountains. They follow what's happening in the world they left behind. They're not ignorant of history and current events. They're simply choosing not to participate directly in the chaos and conflict, choosing instead to preserve what's valuable and wait for a time when they might be needed. It's withdrawal with a purpose, seclusion with responsibility. This raises interesting questions about engagement versus withdrawal. Is it noble to retreat from the world's problems to preserve wisdom and culture? Or is it a kind of selfishness, an abandonment of those suffering in the outside world? Hilton doesn't give us easy answers. Conway, the main character, is torn by exactly these questions. Part of him is seduced by Shangri-La's peace and wants to remain there forever. But part of him feels obligated to return to the world, to the life and responsibilities he left behind. The novel's ending is ambiguous, leaving us uncertain about Conway's final choice and whether he ever finds his way back to the valley. These philosophical questions are part of why Shangri-La has remained compelling across generations. It's not just an escape fantasy. It's a thought experiment about what really matters in life, about how we should balance individual peace with social responsibility, about whether withdrawal from conflict is wisdom or cowardice. Different readers will come to different conclusions, but the questions themselves remain vitally important. There's also a darker aspect to Shangri-La that some critics have pointed out, one that becomes more apparent when we examine the novel with modern sensibilities. The power structure in Shangri-La is entirely top-down. The High Lama rules with benevolent authority, but it's still authority. The inhabitants accept his guidance without question. There's no democracy, no representation, no mechanism for the community to collectively make decisions. It's essentially a benevolent dictatorship, and it only works because the dictator is truly benevolent and wise. But what happens if that's not the case? What happens if a less wise or less compassionate person takes control?
There are also troubling racial elements in Hilton's novel that reflect the prejudices of his time. The High Lama, we're told, is European, specifically French. Chang, his chief assistant, is Chinese. But it's made clear that the Tibetan and Chinese inhabitants of the valley can't achieve the same longevity as Europeans. Hilton writes that they don't have the stamina for it, a claim that would rightly be considered racist today. The novel suggests that while people of all backgrounds can live in Shangri-La, there's a hierarchy with Europeans at the top, capable of achievements that others cannot match.
The 1937 film adaptation compounded these issues. A white actor, played by H.B. Warner in yellow face makeup and prosthetics, portrayed Chang, and was even nominated for an Academy Award for the role. This was standard practice in Hollywood at the time, but it's deeply problematic from today's perspective. The film, like the novel, presents Shangri-La as a paradise, but it's a paradise where racial hierarchies still exist, where white Europeans are naturally positioned as leaders and teachers, while Asians serve supporting roles. These aren't just historical curiosities. They matter because they remind us that even our most idealistic visions are shaped by the prejudices and limitations of their time. Hilton imagined Shangri-La as a place beyond conflict and division, but he couldn't entirely escape the colonial and racial attitudes he grew up with. This doesn't necessarily invalidate everything about Shangri-La, but it does complicate it, adding layers of critique alongside the appreciation. In the decades since Lost Horizon was published, various writers have revisited and reimagined Shangri-La, trying to build on what worked in Hilton's vision while addressing some of its problems. Eleanor Cooney and Daniel Altieri published a sequel in 1996 called Shangri-La, The Return to the World of Lost Horizon, which dealt directly with China's invasion of Tibet and the destruction of Tibetan Buddhist culture. Their version of Shangri-La is under threat from the outside world in a way Hilton's wasn't, forcing the inhabitants to engage rather than withdraw. It's a darker, more politicized vision, but one that arguably reflects the realities of what actually happened to Tibet in the mid-20th century. Others have used the Shangri-La concept more loosely, as a jumping-off point for their own utopian or dystopian visions. The idea of a hidden community preserving knowledge and culture while the outside world descends into chaos has been used in science fiction, fantasy, and even video games. Each iteration adds something new, challenges or affirms different aspects of Hilton's original, and in the process keeps the concept alive and evolving. But let's return now to the question at the heart of our journey tonight. Did Shangri-La really exist? We've explored the fictional creation, the ancient legend of Shambhala that inspired it, the real explorations that provided the geographic and cultural details, and the modern attempts to locate and claim the real Shangri-La. We've seen how the name entered our language and culture, how it shaped and was shaped by the anxieties and hopes of the 20th century. But what's the truth? Is there any sense in which Shangri-La can be said to be real? Let's consider the evidence carefully. We know that Hilton created Shangri-La in his imagination, drawing on sources like Joseph Rock's National Geographic articles and the broader Western fascination with Tibet. We know that specific locations, particularly in the Muli region of Sichuan and around the sacred peaks of Yadeng, provided visual and geographic inspiration. We can visit those places today. We can see the monasteries and mountains that Rock photographed. We can walk through the old town of what's now called Shangri-La City and imagine what it might have been like when Rock first arrived there in the 1920s. But those real places aren't Shangri-La in the sense Hilton described. They're real communities with real people living real lives, with all the complexities and difficulties that entails. The monasteries are genuine centers of Buddhist practice, but they're not hidden valleys where people live for centuries. The mountains are spectacular, but they don't conceal a utopian paradise. If you go to Yunnan or Sichuan expecting to find Hilton's Shangri-La, you'll be disappointed, no matter how beautiful the scenery and how interesting the culture. What about Shambhala, the ancient Buddhist legend that predates Hilton's novel by centuries?
Here the question becomes more complex, because Shambhala, as we discussed, exists on multiple levels simultaneously. As a physical location, no one has ever definitively located Shambhala despite centuries of searching. The various places proposed over the years are just that, proposals, without concrete evidence to support them. If Shambhala exists as a geographic location in our ordinary world, it has remained remarkably well hidden. But many Buddhist teachers would say that's missing the point. They would argue that Shambhala is primarily a spiritual concept, a state of being rather than a place on a map. It represents enlightenment, the perfected mind, the possibility of complete liberation from suffering. In this understanding, Shambhala exists in potential within each person. Through meditation and practice, through cultivating wisdom and compassion, we can access Shambhala within ourselves. The journey to Shambhala isn't across mountains and rivers, but through the landscape of consciousness. This interpretation is beautiful and meaningful, but it does shift the question significantly. If Shambhala is entirely internal, entirely psychological or spiritual, then it exists in the same way that any mental state or spiritual realization exists. It's real for the person experiencing it, but it's not a place you could visit or photograph or show to someone else. It becomes metaphorical rather than literal, however powerful and transformative that metaphor might be. Some Buddhist teachers offer a middle path, suggesting that Shambhala might exist in what they call a different dimension or plane of reality, not in our ordinary physical world, but also not purely mental or imaginary. In this view, Shambhala is as real as our world, but exists at a different frequency of vibration, overlapping our reality, but invisible and intangible to ordinary perception.
Only those who have developed sufficient spiritual realization can perceive and enter Shambhala. This is, admittedly, a difficult concept for those of us trained in Western scientific thinking, where something is either physically real or it isn't, with no middle ground. But maybe the question of whether Shangri-La or Shambhala really exists isn't the most important question. Maybe what matters more is what these legends tell us about ourselves, about our deepest needs and longings. The fact that cultures across time and geography have imagined places like Shangri-La and Shambhala, hidden paradises where peace and wisdom prevail, this tells us something significant about the human condition. We long for peace in a world that often seems defined by conflict. We yearn for wisdom in societies that sometimes seem to value everything except wisdom. We dream of places where the frantic pace of modern life slows down, where we have time to think and learn and appreciate beauty, where we're not constantly driven by competition and anxiety. These are universal human desires, and the legends of Shangri-La and Shambhala give form to these desires, making them concrete and imaginable. In that sense, Shangri-La is absolutely real. It's real in the human heart. It's real as an aspiration, as a vision of what life could be like if we organized ourselves differently, if we prioritized different values, if we had the courage to build communities based on wisdom and compassion rather than on power and profit. The fact that no one has found Shangri-La on a map doesn't diminish this reality. Dreams and visions shape the world just as surely as physical facts do, sometimes more so. Consider how many people have been influenced by the idea of Shangri-La, how many have sought to create something like it in their own lives and communities. Intentional communities, spiritual retreats, conservation efforts to preserve beautiful wild places, schools and centers dedicated to preserving wisdom traditions. All of these can be seen as attempts to manifest Shangri-La in our world. They may not achieve perfection, may not replicate Hilton's fictional paradise in every detail, but they're inspired by the same vision, driven by the same hunger for something better than what mainstream society offers.
There's also the question of inner Shangri-La. While Hilton's novel is about a physical place, many readers have understood it as being also about an interior state. When Conway finds peace in Shangri-La, when he lets go of his ambitions and anxieties from the outside world, he's not just changing his physical location, he's changing his relationship to himself and to life. He's finding an inner stability and contentment that doesn't depend on external circumstances. In this reading, the journey to Shangri-La is really a journey inward, to that place of peace and wisdom within ourselves. This interpretation aligns beautifully with Buddhist teachings about the nature of suffering and liberation. Buddhism teaches that suffering comes not from external circumstances, but from our internal reactions to those circumstances, from our grasping and aversion, from our inability to accept things as they are. Liberation comes through transforming our minds, through developing qualities like equanimity, compassion, and wisdom. When we achieve this transformation, we find peace regardless of where we are physically. We carry Shangri-La within us. If we accept this view, then the question shifts from where is Shangri-La to how do we reach Shangri-La? And the answer isn't about crossing mountains or decoding ancient maps. It's about the practices and disciplines that transform consciousness. Meditation, certainly. Mindfulness, the cultivation of compassion and wisdom. Learning to let go of attachments and aversions. Developing equanimity in the face of life's inevitable ups and downs. These are the paths to inner Shangri-La, and they're available to anyone willing to walk them, regardless of where they live or what their circumstances might be. There's something deeply democratic about this interpretation. The geographic Shangri-La, if it exists, is accessible only to a fortunate few who either stumble upon it or are somehow chosen to find it. But the inner Shangri-La is potentially available to everyone. You don't need wealth or connections or physical prowess. You need dedication, patience, and the willingness to do the inner work. This is, perhaps, the most hopeful message we can take from the legend. Paradise isn't a place we need to find somewhere else. It's a potential we can realize right here, right now, in whatever circumstances we find ourselves. And yet, there's also value in the physical quest, in the search for actual places of peace and beauty, because while inner transformation is crucial, we're also embodied beings living in a physical world, and our environment affects us profoundly. There's a reason why spiritual traditions across cultures have established retreats and monasteries in beautiful, remote locations. The external environment supports the internal practice. Trying to find inner peace while living in the middle of chaos and noise is much more difficult than doing so in a place specifically designed to support contemplation and spiritual growth. So perhaps the wisest approach is to honor both dimensions, to work on cultivating inner Shangri-La while also seeking and creating external spaces that support that cultivation. To recognize that while no physical place will be perfect, there are certainly places that come closer to the Shangri-La ideal than others. Places where peace and beauty and wisdom are valued. Where communities have consciously organized themselves around principles of harmony and sustainability. These places exist all over the world. Some of them are in remote mountains, like the original Shangri-La and Shambhala legends suggest. Others are in unexpected locations, hidden in plain sight in cities or suburbs. They might be meditation centers or intentional communities or conservation areas or simply households where people have committed to living mindfully and compassionately. They're not perfect because nothing in our imperfect world can be, but they're attempting to manifest something of the Shangri-La vision.
And here's something interesting. The act of searching for Shangri-La, even if you never find it in a definitive sense, can be transformative in itself. The journey shapes us. When we go looking for peace and wisdom, when we orient our lives toward finding or creating something like Shangri-La, we become different people. We develop qualities we wouldn't have developed otherwise. We see things we wouldn't have seen, meet people we wouldn't have met, learn lessons we wouldn't have learned. Think about all those explorers who searched for Shambhala over the centuries. None of them found it, at least not in the sense of arriving at a hidden kingdom and being welcomed by enlightened masters, but their journeys were still meaningful. They traveled through extraordinary landscapes, encountered different cultures, pushed themselves beyond their comfortable limits. Some, like Nicholas Roerich, created art inspired by their travels that moved and inspired others. Some developed spiritual practices and understandings that enriched their own lives and the lives of those they taught. The search itself had value, regardless of whether it achieved its ostensible goal. This is true for interior searches as well. Someone who dedicates themselves to meditation and spiritual practice, seeking inner Shangri-La, may never achieve perfect enlightenment. Most of us won't, but the practice itself makes our lives better. It reduces suffering, increases compassion, gives us tools for dealing with difficulty. The journey toward inner Shangri-La is worthwhile, even if we never completely arrive. There's a concept in various spiritual traditions that the goal is already present, that enlightenment or liberation or whatever we want to call it isn't something we need to achieve in the future, but something we need to recognize in the present. We're already in Shangri-La. We just don't realize it yet because our perceptions are clouded by ignorance and delusion. The work isn't to get somewhere else, but to remove the obstacles that prevent us from seeing where we already are. This is a profound teaching, though admittedly a difficult one to really grasp. When we're suffering, when life feels overwhelming, telling someone they're already in paradise doesn't usually help. But there's truth to the idea that our experience of life depends largely on perception, on how we're relating to what's happening, rather than what's actually happening. Two people in the same circumstances can have radically different experiences based on their mindset and perspective. One might be miserable, while the other finds contentment. The external situation is the same, but the internal experience is completely different.
So in a sense, Shangri-La is always available. It's available when we let go of our constant striving and simply rest in the present moment. It's available when we appreciate what we have rather than fixating on what we lack. It's available when we connect genuinely with other people, when we experience beauty in nature or art or music, when we act with kindness and compassion. These moments of Shangri-La happen all the time, but we often miss them because we're too caught up in our worries and plans and regrets to notice. Learning to notice these moments, to appreciate them fully when they occur, and to create conditions that allow them to happen more frequently, this is perhaps the practical wisdom we can take from the Shangri-La legend. We may never find or create a perfect paradise, but we can absolutely increase the amount of peace and beauty and wisdom in our lives. We can make choices that move us closer to the Shangri-La ideal, rather than further from it. This is within our power, regardless of our circumstances. Let's think about what those choices might look like in practical terms. Choosing to live more simply, with fewer possessions and complications, creates more mental space and peace. This is part of what Shangri-La represents, a life uncluttered by the excessive materialism of modern consumer culture. We don't need to give up everything and move to a monastery, but we can thoughtfully examine what we actually need versus what we accumulate out of habit or social pressure. Cultivating meaningful relationships, investing time and energy in genuine connection with others, this brings us closer to Shangri-La. The inhabitants of Hilton's Valley live in community. They know and care about each other.
In our fragmented modern world, where people often feel isolated despite being surrounded by others, consciously building and maintaining real relationships is countercultural and deeply important. It requires vulnerability, patience, and commitment, but the rewards are immeasurable. Engaging with beauty and culture, making time for art and music and literature and nature, this too is part of the Shangri-La vision. Remember, the High Lama gathered to his valley the cultural treasures of humanity. He understood that these things have intrinsic value, that they nourish something in us that needs nourishment. In our busy lives, aesthetic and cultural experiences often get pushed aside as luxuries we'll get to when we have time. But perhaps they're necessities, as important to our well-being as food and sleep. Pursuing wisdom through study and contemplation, this is central to both Shangri-La and Shambhala. This doesn't mean we all need to become scholars or philosophers, but it does mean taking seriously the big questions about how to live well, about what matters most, about how to be a good person in a complicated world.
It means reading books that challenge and expand our thinking, having conversations that go beyond superficial small talk, taking time to reflect on our experiences and extract meaning from them. Practicing compassion, both for ourselves and for others, moves us toward the Shangri-La ideal of a community where people genuinely care about each other's well-being. Compassion is a skill that can be developed through practice. We can train ourselves to respond to suffering, whether our own or others, with kindness, rather than with judgment or indifference. We can cultivate the wish for all beings to be free from suffering and the willingness to act on that wish when we're able. Seeking and protecting peace, both inner and outer, is perhaps the most fundamental lesson of Shangri-La. The valley exists as a refuge from the wars and chaos of the outside world. We may not be able to create perfect peace in our lives or in the world, but we can certainly reduce unnecessary conflict and turmoil. We can choose not to engage in drama and gossip. We can walk away from toxic situations when possible. We can create peaceful spaces in our homes and daily routines. We can work in whatever ways are available to us for peace in our communities and in the world. Living in greater harmony with nature brings us closer to the Shangri-La vision. The fictional valley is described as a place of extraordinary natural beauty, and the inhabitants clearly have a respectful relationship with their environment. In our time of ecological crisis, when human activity is causing unprecedented damage to the planet, reconnecting with nature and living more sustainably isn't just idealistic, it's necessary. This might mean spending more time outdoors, supporting conservation efforts, reducing our environmental footprint, or simply paying more attention to the natural world around us. All of these practices, and many others, are ways of manifesting Shangri-La in our actual lives. They won't create a perfect paradise. Real life is messy and complicated and full of difficulties that can't be completely avoided. But they can make our lives significantly better, more peaceful, more meaningful, more aligned with our deepest values. And if enough people make these choices, if enough communities organize themselves around these principles, we move collectively closer to the kind of world that Shangri-La represents. This brings us back to the prophetic dimension of both Shangri-La and Shambhala. Remember, the High Lama in Hilton's novel believes that the world is heading for catastrophe, that civilization will tear itself apart in war, but that Shangri-La will survive to help rebuild. Similarly, the Shambhala prophecy speaks of a future time when the world has descended into darkness and the Kulika king emerges to usher in a golden age. Both visions contain an element of hope beyond despair.
A promise that even after the worst has happened, renewal is possible.
We're living in a time when these themes feel particularly relevant. Climate change threatens unprecedented disruption. Political polarization and conflict seem to be intensifying. The gap between rich and poor grows wider. Technologies that were supposed to connect us often leave us feeling more isolated and anxious. It's easy to feel that we're heading for some kind of breakdown, that the systems and structures of our current civilization are unsustainable and must eventually collapse. In this context, the Shangri-La vision offers two related forms of hope. First, it suggests that even if the worst happens, if our civilization does experience catastrophic disruption, the essential things, the wisdom and culture and knowledge that make us human, can be preserved. They can survive the storm and be there to help us rebuild afterward. This is part of why libraries and museums and educational institutions are so important. They're our version of Shangri-La's preservation function, protecting humanity's heritage for future generations. Second, and perhaps more importantly, Shangri-La suggests that we don't have to wait for catastrophe and renewal. We can start creating better ways of living right now. We can be the change we want to see. We can establish communities and practices and institutions that embody the values of peace and wisdom and harmony. And if enough people do this, maybe we can avoid the catastrophe altogether, or at least mitigate its severity. Maybe the renewal doesn't have to come after the collapse. Maybe it can happen gradually, peacefully, through conscious choice, rather than through destruction and rebuilding from ruins. This is an empowering message. It puts agency in our hands. We're not just passive observers waiting for either catastrophe or salvation. We're active participants who can shape what happens through our choices and actions. Every person who cultivates inner peace contributes to collective peace. Every community that organizes around sustainable, harmonious principles demonstrates that such organization is possible. Every act of wisdom and compassion ripples outward in ways we can't fully predict or measure. And maybe this is the deepest truth of Shangri-La. It's not a place we find or a destination we reach. It's a direction we move in, a constant orientation toward peace and wisdom and harmony. It's the intention to live well and to help others live well. It's the commitment to preserving and creating beauty in a world that often seems bent on destroying it. It's the choice, made over and over again, to respond to life's challenges with grace and compassion rather than with fear and anger. In this sense, every moment offers us the choice of Shangri-La. When something difficult happens, we can react automatically, letting our conditioned patterns of stress and anxiety take over. Or we can pause, breathe, and respond with the kind of centered awareness that we imagine the inhabitants of Shangri-La might possess.
When we are faced with conflict, we can escalate or we can seek peace. When we encounter suffering, we can turn away or we can respond with compassion. When we have resources, we can hoard them or we can share generously. Each choice moves us either toward or away from the Shangri-La ideal. None of us will make the right choice every time. We're human, which means we're flawed and imperfect, and we make mistakes. But the intention matters. The effort matters. The direction we're heading matters. And the beautiful thing is that every moment offers a fresh chance. Made a poor choice just now? The next moment is an opportunity to choose differently. Lived unconsciously for days or weeks or months? The present moment is always available for a fresh start. This is perhaps why the Shangri-La legend has remained so powerful and relevant across decades and generations. It speaks to something timeless in human nature, this longing for peace and wisdom and beauty, this sense that life could be better than it usually is, this intuition that there are ways of being and living that we've glimpsed but not yet fully realized. And it suggests that this better way isn't completely out of reach. isn't only possible in some far-off place we can never find, or in some far future time after everything collapses and is rebuilt. It's available, at least partially, right here and right now, through how we choose to live. So, did Shangri-La really exist? The answer depends on what we mean by exist and what we mean by Shangri-La. As a specific geographic location matching Hilton's description, no, it didn't exist and doesn't exist, except perhaps in the limited sense that real places provided inspiration for the fictional setting. As an ancient Buddhist kingdom called Shambhala, the evidence is ambiguous at best, though the legend is certainly real and meaningful within that tradition. As a metaphor and an ideal, as a direction to move in and a vision to work toward, yes, Shangri-La exists and has always existed. It exists in human longing and human aspiration. It exists in every attempt to create peace and preserve wisdom. It exists in moments of beauty and connection and grace that punctuate even the most difficult lives. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's all it needs to be. The power of Shangri-La isn't diminished by the fact that no explorer ever found it on a map. If anything, its non-existence as a physical place makes it more powerful as a psychological and spiritual reality. It remains always ahead of us, always beckoning, always possible but never quite achieved. And in that liminal space between real and imagined, between here and there, between now and someday, it continues to inspire and guide us toward being better than we are. As our journey together tonight comes to a close, I want you to take a moment to think about what Shangri-La means to you. Not the place in the book or the legend, but your Shangri-La, the particular vision of peace and wisdom and beauty that calls to you.
What would it look like? What would it feel like to live there? And more importantly, what small steps could you take to move your actual life in that direction? Maybe your Shangri-La is a place of greater simplicity, free from the clutter and complications that currently weigh you down. Maybe it's a place of deeper connections, where you have meaningful relationships and genuine community. Maybe it's a place where you have more time for the things that truly matter to you. Time to read and think and create and simply be. Maybe it's a place of greater harmony with nature, or a place where your work aligns with your values, or a place where you feel at peace with yourself and the world. Whatever your particular vision of Shangri-La might be, it's telling you something important about what you need, about what would nourish your soul and allow you to flourish. Listen to that vision, honor it, and recognize that while you may never fully realize it, you can absolutely move toward it. Each choice you make either brings you closer to your Shangri-La or takes you further from it. Choose wisely. Choose consciously. Choose with intention. Remember, too, that the journey to Shangri-La is not meant to be made alone. In Hilton's novel, Shangri-La is a community. In the Shambhala legend, it's a kingdom full of beings working together for wisdom and peace. We need each other. We need to support each other's journeys. We need to create and sustain communities both physical and virtual, where the values of Shangri-La can be practiced and celebrated. Reach out to others who share your vision. Build connections. Collaborate on creating the kind of world you want to live in. And be patient with yourself and with the process. The inhabitants of Shangri-La live for centuries, which gives them time to develop wisdom and peace at a gradual, sustainable pace. We don't have centuries, but we have our lifetimes, and that's enough if we use the time well. Transformation doesn't happen overnight. Creating a life aligned with your deepest values is work that unfolds over years and decades. There will be setbacks and difficulties. There will be times when you feel you're moving backward rather than forward. This is all part of the journey. What matters is that you keep going, keep choosing, keep oriented toward your vision of what life could be. The The search for Shangri-La continues. It has continued for centuries and will continue for centuries more, as long as human beings long for peace and wisdom and beauty. You're part of that search now. You're one of countless seekers across time and space, all looking for that hidden valley of harmony and grace. You may never find it in the way you imagine it, but in the seeking itself, in the orientation of your life toward those highest values, you'll find something valuable. You'll find meaning and purpose. You'll find moments of genuine peace. You'll find connections with others who share your quest.
And you'll contribute, in your own unique way, to bringing a little more light into the world. That's what Shangri-La is ultimately about. Not escaping from the world's darkness, but bringing light into it. Not withdrawing from difficulty, but meeting it with wisdom and compassion. Not waiting for paradise to appear, but creating it here and now, as best we can, with what we have. This is the work. This is the way. This is how Shangri-La becomes real. Thank you for joining me on this journey tonight. Thank you for opening your mind and heart to this exploration of myth and history, of longing and possibility. I hope the story of Shangri-La stays with you, whispers to you when you need it, reminds you that peace is possible even when it seems impossibly far away. As you drift off to sleep tonight, let yourself imagine that hidden valley. See the mountains rising against impossibly blue skies. See the prayer flags streaming in the wind. See the monasteries and gardens and the faces of people living in harmony. Know that this vision, in all its beauty, lives within you. It's part of your heritage as a human being, part of our collective dream of what life could be. And know that every day offers you opportunities to make that dream a little more real, to bring a little more of Shangri-La into the world through how you choose to live. Sleep well, dear friend. May your dreams be peaceful. May you wake tomorrow with renewed energy for the journey ahead. May you find your own path to Shangri-La, and may that path be blessed with beauty and wonder and grace. Until we meet again for another story, another exploration, another journey through the landscapes of myth and mystery and human longing, I wish you well. Take care of yourself. Take care of each other. And remember always that the search for paradise begins right where you are, right here, right now, in this very moment. And before we part tonight, if you've enjoyed this journey to Shangri-La, if these stories and reflections have resonated with you, I'd be deeply grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me continue creating these explorations into myths and legends, these deep dives into the stories that have shaped how we understand ourselves and our world. There are so many more tales to tell, so many more mysteries to explore together. By subscribing, you ensure you won't miss future journeys as we wander through history and legend, seeking meaning and beauty in the stories that have captivated humanity across centuries and cultures. Leave a comment below telling me what Shangri-La means to you, or if there are other myths and legends you'd like me to explore. I love hearing from you, learning what resonates, discovering what questions and curiosities you bring to these ancient stories. Your engagement and enthusiasm make this work meaningful and worthwhile. Until next time, my dear wanderer, may you carry the light of Shangri-La within you. May you find peace in the midst of chaos, wisdom in the face of confusion, and beauty wherever you go. Sweet dreams and farewell.